This week on Frontiers, we're looking back at the Exxon Valdez oil spill at the 30-year mark. Hard to believe 30 years have gone by. But joining us now to talk about that is Rick Steiner, a conservation biologist. You were one of the first people out on the spill, following it. I kind of want to get your impressions of what it was like. Bring us back to where you were and what you were doing when you first got out there.
Well, that morning I was supposed to go out on a research cruise with the Department of Fish and Game to look at overwinter survival of salmon elevin in the streams. Got the call, got in a plane, flew over the tanker. Even at altitude, you had volatile organic compounds and vapors.
So you could really smell it?
Oh yeah, even at 1,000 feet. And then landed in Valdez, went in the Exxon command center, introduced myself. They had no clue as to what to do. They didn't know the local area. And so out of that, a command team was formed with the Coast Guard, the state of Alaska, Exxon, and ourselves, local fishermen, through which several local people flowed into that command system. And after, for the first 3 days, flat calm, they could have done a response, but they didn't have any equipment. They would really never anticipated it. I will also say the notion of complacency. The night before, Alyeska was patting themselves on their own back at the Valdez Convention Center for having done a great job for a little spill that they responded to right there at the terminal before. And so this sort of attitude of overconfidence and complacency and hubris and arrogance was very much a cause then.
Part of the culture almost.
It's part of the culture, and it happens in government, it happens in industry. I guess it happens in all of us. That's why a group like the RCAC is so important, the Citizens Advisory Council.
The Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council. I want to just go back to one thing that you said, is that culture of arrogance. Everyone in the industry now assures us that there is a culture of competence and a culture of care.
Well, we're certainly safer in Prince William Sound. We should have been prior to Exxon Valdez, but they waited for the disaster and then put it in place. What I worry about is this culture in the oil industry and government of rolling the dice, hoping the disaster won't happen on your watch, run the system to failure, and then when it does fail, then fix things. That's not smart thinking.
Well, that tanker, the Exxon Valdez, it was headed to Long Beach. It had 53 million gallons of oil, 11 million spilled, but what about a fifth of what was on board? And if you listen to the audio of Captain Joe Hazelwood talking to traffic, he's saying, I'm going to try to rock it off of this a little bit. If he had persisted, he was warned, stop, a tide's coming in, you don't want to do this. I mean, are we lucky in a weird way to say, after all we've been through with the spill, are we lucky to try to rock it off of that reef?
I guess in some sense, we think the total volume spilled, though, by the way, is probably twice what the official estimate was. It's probably more like 20 to 25 million gallons. Regardless, it could have lost the entire load, no question. So they did a good job lightering, offloading what was left on the tanker, but a lot of that was water mixed with oil, and they didn't do the math right on that. But in a sense, too, dead is dead, and 40, 50,000 tons of this toxic, persistent chemical hydrocarbon flowing into this incredibly productive coastal ecosystem right at the worst time of year, the biological spring, when the salmon were coming out, the herring were coming in to spawn, otters were pupping, harbor seals were pupping, seabirds were coming back. It couldn't have happened in a worse place at a worse time, and it did. And to this day,
that's kind of the nature of disasters, isn't it?
They do. They just come up when you least expect them, and we are wrong to think that we've got it all sorted out and it won't happen. History is littered with industrial disasters that were never supposed to happen.
One thing we didn't get to talk about in the show, and I wanted to, we reached out to Chiniga, some of the leaders there, and they just said, we'd prefer you leave us alone right now. It brings up a lot of trauma. Please respect that.
It does. And Chiniga was probably...
But I feel like their story needs to be heard.
It does, and Chiniga Bay had they were devastated by the tsunami and the 1964 earthquake over on Chiniga Island.
That's right, they were wiped out.
They were wiped out. The tsunami came in, like a third of the village were killed. And so they had just, before Exxon Valdez, just reformed the village down on Evans Island near the Sawmill Bay hatchery. and we're just starting to get life back together and normal and such like that. Then boom, Exxon Valdez comes and the oil flows right past and onto their village shores. And the chaos that ensued over the next many, many years, you got to feel sorry for the folks there. And so certainly respect the fact that you folks, gave them some space on this. And there's people all over Cordova and other communities that simply don't want to talk about it anymore. And I certainly respect that. We need to remember it. It's an important point in Alaska history and our nation's history.
But it's so easy to forget, and even just kind of going back to these articles and looking at what's online. And by gosh, there's so much online, so much really good information. I was astounded by how much I had forgotten from that time.
You can forget, which is why doing programs like you're doing are important to help us at least remember the severity of the damage caused, both short-term and long-term. The place has not recovered. It likely never will fully recover. So when we think about drilling in the Arctic and other areas and oil shipping and such like that, we need to incorporate this into our risk analysis and remember that, while these may be low probability events, they could have enormous long-term, even permanent consequences.
Well, permanent.
Yeah.
So, a lot has recovered. We see a lot of species that have recovered, but is the oil going to be with us forever? Because, like in Chiniga, for example, they say you can go across from the village to some islands and dig down and you will find goo.
It's there. Yeah, the oil is there. It's thousands of gallons, not hundreds of thousands of gallons, but it's there in the beach sediments where it percolated down deep into the substrate.
And they don't want to disturb it?
Well, it's still pretty toxic. It asphalted over on the surface is still pretty toxic. But the bigger issue from environmental recovery standpoint is the lack of recovery of herring, the AT1 orca pod.
Now tell us a little bit about the orca pod.
The orca pod is a genetically distinct, unique orca pod listed by the National Marine Fisheries Service as a distinct population segment, a different organism, a different animal altogether. They had lost 22 animals, 22 of their members within the first few years, or a bunch of their members. Now they're down to 7. They were 22, they lost a bunch, now they're down to 7. No reproductive females, they're expected to go extinct. We saw them surfacing that summer in the oil, so they were aspirating, likely, the oil into their blowholes. Many of them died. There were something like 29 killer whales that died from this. Another 25 gray whales washed up down towards Kodiak that summer, and many of those were probably killed by the oil.
Well, there's this odd mix of fragility and resilience because, you see so many of the species, the otters are back, after 2,800, probably more because their carcasses sink, so you can't count them. But at 30 years, what thought comes to mind for you? Something you feel deep in your gut.
That we should have prevented this. And, I still regret to this day that we were not successful at getting the Citizens Advisory Council set up prior to this. We tried. The oil industry said get lost. The state government said get lost. We did have a state senator, our state senator at the time, introduce legislation into the Senate that would have looked at this. And that was killed.
Nobody wants these citizens advisory councils because they worry that they'll gum up development, cause litigation.
And they don't. They're part of what is known now as responsible development. You have got to engage the stakeholders, those with the most at risk and those with the most to say and most to benefit by safe operations of industrial activities. That has to do with oil, it has to do with mining, it can have to do with any large-scale resource industry.
One of the things on the Exxon Valdez is kind of not understanding the weather patterns at that time of the year and the cleanup. Now, a Citizens Advisory Council might have
They've done a lot. They've done a lot on weather. They've done a lot on ice forecasting. They've held the feet to the fire of the oil industry and the government. Out of Exxon Valdez came Oil Pollution Act of 1990, requiring double hulls tankers to be phased in. Globally, the International Maritime Organization followed suit and phased in double hull tankers around the world. So now the global fleet of 7,000 to 8,000 crude oil tankers is all double hulled because of the Exxon Valdez. So that's a real testament to getting it right.
How about the Oil Pollution Act? that
Yeah.
was passed after that.
That was one of the acts, that's the act that required that in the United States. But also, I will also mention that the tanker owners, some of them, went beyond the federal standard, put in twin engines, twin rudders, twin propellers, bow thrusters, even beyond what the feds require right now, because they know the safest boat is the best boat, and they don't want to suffer the liability. Look at BP is on the hook for $64 billion US dollars in the Gulf spill.
Now, one thing I want to bring up, I didn't have time to get to it in the show, but there are audio recordings, of course, of Hazelwood's radio traffic, but there was also audio recording of Exxon executives, communicating to the cleanup crews, to the Marine Traffic Center. And one of the things that is just astounding, and you can go online and hear it, but is it Don Cornett from Exxon?
He was their PR guy. Yeah.
He said, he's heard to say, I don't care if you get 1 gallon of oil out there, something to that effect. I want you to look like you're doing something.
Make it look good. I mean,
I was astounded.
Yeah, it was all spin control to them at that point. Because really, honestly, after the oil is in the water, you've lost the battle, and you're not going to recover. When they did the math at the end of this, they may have recovered 7% of what was spilled. In the Gulf spill, they physically recovered from the environment maybe 3%, and that's generally about what happens. So Exxon wanted boats out there towing booms hither and yon, looking like they were doing something for the TV cameras, whether they were collecting any oil or not. And I will commend some of our Cordova fishermen for going out there with buckets and starting to scoop up oil and put it in their holds and take it to transshipment facilities.
My goodness.
Yeah, there was a lot of signs of.
Well, before we go, I want you to hand me that book over there.
Oh, sure.
I left it over there. But I want to point this out to anybody, that this book is absolutely free. Personal stories from the Exxon Valdez disaster. You're in there, I think. And,
a lot of
and
people
the
are.
Exxon executive, Don Cornett. But what they did is Sharon Bushell and Stan Jones interviewed lots of people, from oil executives to cleanup crew members to fishermen, Governor Cooper, who was governor at the time, and their stories are 1 or 2 pages each, but it's really a quick way and an interesting way to get a view of the magnitude of this, just through the human stories. And the best part of this is absolutely free. It won't cost you anything if you want it. Great for kids, and you can pick it up at the Prince William Sound Regional Advisory Council offices in Spenard, and write to me if you want to get their address and more information on that, and I'll post it on the Frontiers Facebook page. But Rick, just a final thought, final words for us to leave us with on this 30th anniversary?
Well, one final thought I have is, we need to prevent oil spills as much as possible. The big oil spill that we really need to prevent is the U.S. is using 20 million barrels of oil a day. That's 80 times what the Exxon Valdez spilled. And we're using that every day. All that carbon is ultimately going into the atmosphere and then into the oceans, wreaking ecological and climate chaos. We need to do better about stopping waste for that use, and to switch to low-carbon alternatives. So that's the oil spill we really need to get on with.
That's not something that the state wants to hear when it benefits from oil revenues. But
it's the scientific fact, and everybody knows it, so we need to get on with it.
All right, Rick Steiner, thank you very much for joining us. And
my pleasure.
We want you to be sure to watch Frontiers on Sunday for a good overview of what happened on March 24th, 1989. Thanks.
Thanks for marking the anniversary.